standard or traditional 6-bar rappel rack is known by many names. It is sometimes referred to as a J-frame or open frame rack, or as a coal rack after its inventor. There are many variations that use different length and width frames, different orientations of the connecting eye, more or less than the usual 6 brake bars, different types of brake bars, and different ways of attaching the device to a harness. However, the basic function of all of these devices is the same. The rope is passed back and forth around the brake bars, and by varying the number of bars, the spacing between them, the angle the rope exits the bottom of the rack, and the tension on the tail of the rope, descent speed can be controlled during a rappel. The open frame rack is probably the most versatile rappel device ever invented, in that it has a wide range of friction adjustment that can be modified during a rappel and a lot of surface area for dissipating heat. So it's suitable for use on the shortest to longest rappels, using a wide variety of rope types in a wide variety of conditions. The closest thing to a standard configuration is a 14-inch long stainless steel frame that is 2 inches wide, with a welded eye and 6 brake bars. Most commercially available open frame rappel racks carry an NFPA rating, with a minimum braking strength of 13.5 kilonewtons, and can be used with ropes between 9 and 13 millimeters in diameter. They are also wide enough to be used with double ropes. Open frame racks are made today by SMC, Petzl, and CMI. Most frames are made from stainless steel bar stock with a welded eye for connecting to the harness. The long side of the frame is commonly called the closed side, and the bars are installed so that they hinge on this closed side. The short or open side of the frame typically has a lock nut to retain the bars. Historically, there have been racks that used a coiled or wrapped eye, but these were weaker and bulkier than the welded eye and aren't sold anymore. Frames are either flat, where the eye is in the same plane as the bars, or twisted, where the eye has a 90-degree orientation relative to the bars. Brake bars are typically either aluminum, as in the original design, or stainless steel. Most cavers today favor stainless steel for its longer life and the fact that it doesn't stain the rope with aluminum oxide. But aluminum provides more friction and better heat dissipation. The brake bars can be switched with one another to even out wear, and if they do wear out, they can be replaced. The top bar is often a little larger than the rest, and the top 1 or 2 bars usually come with a groove or dimple that helps keep the rope centered, which reduces the potential for wear on the frame. Some cavers use a hyperbar on the top, also known as a tie-off bar, which is longer and equipped with a spur that provides the ability to add friction as well as speeding up the process of locking off. For especially long rappels where the rope weight below the rack can be substantial, longer frames up to 24 inches in length are sometimes used, though these are more of a specialty device. Many cavers also install spacers between the first few bars to help prevent them from getting jammed together, especially on longer drops. Some of the drawbacks to an open frame rack, when compared to other caving descenders, are the greater length and weight. This makes it more difficult to carry or wear through a cave, especially if there's a lot of climbing or crawling, and the greater length makes it more difficult to perform mid-rope maneuvers such as changeovers, crossing knots, or crossing rebelays. The traditional rappel rack is more compatible with indestructible rope rigging technique than with alpine rigging. Most other caving descenders have a recommended maximum pitch limitation of 100 meters, but the rappel rack can be used on any length pitch, so it's the only practical option for long, uninterrupted rappels such as Surprise Pit, Fantastic Pit, Golondrinas, the New River Gorge Bridge, or El Capitan. The intent of the original John Cole rack design, and the recommended orientation, is to have the open side of the frame facing away from the caver such that the bars are perpendicular to the caver's body, and the caver is looking at the bar ends that are attached to the closed side of the frame. This is also sometimes referred to as a vertical orientation. In this orientation, the free end of the rope can be moved to the caver's right or left in order to facilitate adding or removing bars during the rappel. If the harness being used is a climbing style harness with a belay rappel loop, and the rack is attached with a locking carabiner or Myon, then a flat frame will give the preferred orientation. However, if the harness being used is a caving style harness with a D Myon, and the rack is connected with a locking carabiner or Myon, then a twisted eye rack is necessary to give the preferred orientation. In the alternative, so-called parallel or horizontal orientation, the free end of the rope must be moved towards or away from the caver to add or remove brake bars during a rappel. I have found that in most situations there's not much advantage in one orientation or the other, and I would argue the choice is mostly one of personal preference. Also, there's enough links in the chain between the harness and the rack that there's at least 90 degrees of rotation available when the whole system is weighted. But you should be aware that there are traditionalists who characterize these two orientations as proper versus improper, and many go so far as to call it the difference between right and wrong. It does become more important on very long jobs, where rope weight below the rack is considerable, to have the rack rigged in a perpendicular or vertical orientation. It's usually recommended to use a connector such as a locking beaner or my-own rapide to attach the rack to the master attachment point of a caving-style harness. This allows the rack to be removed if necessary, without opening the central D-my-own or Omni carabiner. There are some cavers, though, who prefer to connect the rack directly to this master attachment point and just leave it attached at all times. This lowers the attachment, which makes maneuvers such as changeovers easier, and it eliminates some risks, such as cross-loading of the connecting carabiner. However, by removing one of the connecting links, the orientation is changed by 90 degrees, so the choice of frame type may also need to adapt. If leaving a rack attached to the harness at all times, then most cavers will use a non-locking carabiner on a gear loop to clip to the frame in order to keep the rack off to the side and out of the way while ascending or traveling through horizontal cave. If connecting the rack to a master attachment point with a locking carabiner, then carefully evaluate the type of carabiner being used. It has been shown that some carabiner models are prone to cross-loading or having the eye of the rack lever against the gate when the rack has been unweighted and reweighted. This phenomenon, where the caver becomes disconnected from their rack, is sometimes called rollout. There are some video examples on the internet of carabiner gates that can break under body weight if cross-loaded in just the right way. It's also possible to either forget to lock the gate or have the lock vibrate open. If using a locking carabiner, then consider one of the models designed for belay use, such as the DMM Belay Master, Black Diamond Gridlock, or any of the Petzl models that use the captive. These are all equipped with a plastic bracket or gate mechanism that resists cross-loading. Auto-locking gates are also more resistant to coming open than traditional screw-lock mechanisms. A my-own is a stronger and safer option as a connector, but is a bit slower to attach and detach from the harness, and they are more likely to become stuck and require a wrench to open or close. A 7 or 8mm long frame my-own will be plenty strong and has a gate opening wide enough for attaching to a 10mm D my-own or Omni carabiner. If you want to change the orientation of the rack without buying a new frame, then there are my-owns and locking carabiners available that have a 90-degree twist. A my-own rapide twist, or Kong Ovalone DNA carabiner, will change the rack orientation from horizontal to vertical, or vice versa. As with any descender, it's a best practice to perform a rappel test while you still have a safety backup attached, and before fully committing to the rappel. This provides an extra level of protection against issues such as rollout or cross-loading of a carabiner. To attach a rack to the rope, and start by positioning the rope on the face of the top of the number 1 bar. This will be the face with a groove or dimple. Bring the rope from right to left and swing the second bar closed. If the swing bars have a hook, then you may need to squeeze the open end of the frame a little to get the bars to click into position. Then swing the rope back to the opposite side and close the third bar. Continue until the desired number of bars are attached to the open side of the frame. The number of bars will depend on the amount of friction that is expected. Never use fewer than 4 bars, but 4 bars might be appropriate if using a large diameter rope, a dirty or stiff rope, rappelling a long pitch with a lot of rope weight below, or for a low angle pitch. The maximum of 6 bars would be more appropriate in low friction conditions. 5 bars is probably the most common and provides a good starting point for many commonly encountered conditions, but if there's any doubt, then start with all 6 bars engaged, and then remove bars after starting the rappel to reduce friction if necessary. The judgment about how many bars to use will become easier with experience. Be careful of rope pitches where the variables change suddenly, such as when a low-angle pitch crosses a lip and becomes free-hanging, or a very dirty rope passes into a waterfall and becomes cleaner and wet. When using a rack, be especially careful to secure loose clothing or long hair. The length of an open-frame rack and the nature of how the rope feeds into the brake bars creates good conditions for entrainment. If this happens, the best option is to stop immediately and attach a tethered descender above the rack and attempt to unweight it. Never use a knife around a tensioned rope. The best strategy, though, is to focus on prevention. Secure loose clothing, tie hair far up and away from the rack, and avoid turning the head during a rappel in a way that would expose the side or back of the head to the brake bars. Most swing bars have a slight hook or slant to the slot that fits into the open side of the frame that allows them to stay in place when the rack is not in use, as well as preventing the bottom bar from unintentionally swinging open during a rappel. The symmetry of most racks, when combined with the hook on the swing bars, makes it possible to rig the rack backwards, such that the rope runs across the backside of the bars. This is commonly known as a suicide rig. When the caver then applies body weight, the bars will suddenly pop open, and the rack, as well as the caver, will become disconnected from the rope. This is undoubtedly the greatest hazard associated with rack use, and it has cost lives. When first attaching the rack to a rope, ensure that the rope contacts the face of the first bar, which usually has a groove or dimple where the rope should run. As long as the rope runs on the correct side of the first bar, and the rope alternates direction around all subsequent bars, then it should be in the proper orientation. Some racks have a straight slotted second bar, which will not be held closed if the rack is rigged backwards. I recommend this type of straight slot be used for the second bar if the bars have a symmetrical round cross-section. However, most modern stainless steel swing bars are U-shaped, with a round face and an open backside. Rigging the rack backwards with this style of bar is usually immediately apparent. Once you're attached to the rope and have successfully performed a safety check, it's time to descend. The open-framed rack is designed to be used with both hands and can be used either right or left-handed. If right-handed, then the right hand is known as the brake hand, and it's used to adjust the angle of the rope as it exits the bottom bar of the rack, and to apply some tension to the free end of the rope. The left hand is known as the cradle hand, and it's wrapped around the bottom few bars and is used to either push the bars together or pull them apart to control their spacing. The more spread out the bars, the less contact the rope makes and therefore the less friction. By contrast, jamming the bars together increases the contact between the rope and bars and increases the friction. Both hands are used in controlling the rate of descent, and because the rope creates friction against the brake hand and the bars become hot against the cradle hand, it's critical that gloves be worn while rappelling, and even more than with other descenders, it's a good idea to use leather gloves. Thin leather gloves are recommended to provide a good balance between protection and dexterity. Most of the speed control while descending is made by adjusting the spacing of the bars and adding or removing bars. All of this can and should be done while moving, which takes some time and experience to become proficient. A common sequence is to begin a rappel with all 6 bars engaged. You may then realize that there's too much friction, and spreading the bars doesn't do enough to get moving down the rope. At this point, a bar may be removed, and the lower 2 to 3 bars can be spread further apart. If there's still too much friction, then it may be necessary to drop to 4 bars. This is generally only necessary when there's some combination of a very long rope pitch with a lot of rope weight below the caver's not very heavy, or the rope is especially fat and stiff. On long rope pitches, it may be necessary to periodically add bars back during the descent as the rope weight below the rack decreases. In my experience rappelling the 1,500-foot Black Canyon of the Gunnison, I started at the top with 4 bars, added a 5th bar about halfway down, and had to add a 6th bar when I was about 200 feet off the ground. Rappelling speed is a very personal choice. A faster rappel will generate more heat, which at the extreme can start to damage the sheath of the rope. You should never get moving so fast that there's ever a concern about reaching a ledge or the ground with enough speed to cause injury, or too fast that you can't quickly come to a stop if needed to avoid a mid-pitch obstacle. If your rack is equipped with a hyperbar, it can be used as another way to add friction for speed control, though it's rarely used for this purpose with an open frame rack, as it is with a micro rack. When using a hyperbar with U-shaped stainless brake bars, it should not be used for adding friction due to the sharp angle the rope takes around the bottom bar. It should only be used for locking off in this situation. In almost all circumstances, the combination of varying the number of bars and the spacing between the bars is all that's required for speed control. The primary use of a hyperbar for an open frame rack is to aid in locking off for hands-free duties such as rigging or changeovers. The hyperbar may be used in a situation where there's a momentary loss of control and the caver starts descending too quickly. This can be used for temporary speed control while additional bars are added, and is a good alternative in an emergency to doing something more extreme such as a leg wrap. The free end of the rope can simply hang between the legs, or it can rest against the hip or thigh for a small amount of additional friction. Be careful to not allow the rope to run against the harness though. To lock off a rack for hands-free functions, it's best to start by coming to a stop and engaging all 6 bars. Bring the tail of the rope up and over the top of the number 1 bar. If there's no hyperbar, then wrap the rope between the top of the frame and the rope. Once the tail of the rope is brought back down, there are a few options for finishing the lock-off. If there is a hyperbar, then the rope can be brought back under the bottom bar, and a bight of rope with a half twist can be brought over the top of the hyperbar and cinched tight. If there's no hyperbar, then the rope can be brought under the bottom bar, and a bight of rope can be brought up and around the full body of the rack and tied off with an overhand. Alternatively, a bight of rope can be fed through the connection carabiner or myone and brought around the body of the rack and tied off with an overhand. This tie-off process is slower to perform and uses much more rope than is required for a bobbin, which is one of the key reasons an open frame rack is less efficient when combined with alpine-style rigging that utilizes frequent rebelays. Open frame racks are not designed for belaying a lead climber. The forces that can be generated in a lead fall can cause the frame to deform, so it should not be used for this purpose. However, racks are quite commonly used for lowering a live load in rescue situations, including lowering both the patient and rescuer. The strength and excellent friction adjustment properties of rappel racks make them the preferred choice for this application. As with any critical piece of caving gear, racks should be inspected regularly. Check for sharp edges or burrs along the frame and check the faces of the brake bars for excessive wear. If a hole forms in a stainless bar, then replace it. Before a hole wears through, bars can be swapped. The highest bars create most of the friction and therefore suffer the most wear. By swapping bars 2 and 6, as well as bars 3 and 5 on a regular basis, the bars will last longer. When replacing a bar, ensure that the swing bars hinge on the closed side of the frame and that they alternate in which direction they swing open. Make sure that the lock nut on the end of the open side of the frame is fully tightened and one row of threads extends beyond the end of the nut. Also check that the bars slide freely up and down the frame. Rappelling practice in a controlled environment and experience over time will improve your proficiency with a rack. It's also wise to practice some of the basic vertical skills such as changeovers, crossing knots, crossing deviations, and crossing rebelays, in combination with your preferred ascending system.